There's a mansion overlooking the Pacific Coast Highway where the richest man in the world built a monument to ancient Rome. He never saw it. He died 6,000 miles away, buried next to two sons who had already gone before him. The Getty name once meant oil, art, and unimaginable wealth. But drive past their estates today and you'll feel something else. An emptiness that has nothing to do with whether anyone lives there. These billion-dollar properties were built to be homes. Instead, they became monuments to tragedy. The Patriarch and his Empire. Jean-Paul Getty was born in 1892 in Minneapolis, the only child of a lawyer who had the foresight to see the future in oil. In 1903, when young Paul was just 10 years old, his father, George Getty, headed to Oklahoma and founded the Minnehaha Oil Company. Within 2 years, George had made enough money to move his family to a splendid mansion in Los Angeles. But this was just the beginning. By 1916, when he was 23 years old, Jean-Paul Getty had already made his first million. The world was at war, and oil was the lifeblood of the new industrial age. While other young men his age were being sent to European trenches, Getty was drilling for black gold in the red dirt of Oklahoma. He was sharp, driven, and utterly relentless in his pursuit of wealth. But there was something else about J. Paul Getty, something that would define not just his life, but the lives of everyone who bore his name. He was a man who understood the value of money better than the value of people. His father had seen it coming. When George Getty died in 1930, he left his son only $500,000 of a $10 million fortune, convinced that Jean-Paul would destroy the family. The elder Getty was wrong about the business. His son didn't destroy it. He built it into an empire that made him the richest man in the world. But the family? That was a different story. Getty's business acumen was legendary. In the 1940s and 50s, he made a gamble that would cement his fortune forever. He negotiated a 60-year lease on a barren tract of land between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait for $9.5 million, agreeing to pay an additional $1 million per year for the duration of the lease. Most people thought he was insane. The land looked worthless. But Getty understood geology, he understood oil, and in 1953, when oil began flowing from that desert at a rate of 16 million barrels per year, he became unstoppable. By 1957, Fortune magazine declared J. Paul Getty the wealthiest living American. 9 years later, the Guinness Book of Records named him the world's wealthiest private citizen, worth over $1 billion. In today's money, that would be nearly $9 billion. He had everything money could buy: multiple mansions, priceless art collections, a business empire that stretched across continents. And yet, as those closest to him would discover, he was willing to buy nothing when it came to the people who needed him most. The stories about Getty's miserliness became legendary, the kind of anecdotes that people still tell at dinner parties. He installed a payphone in his mansion in England so that guests would have to use their own coins to make calls. He counted every penny, negotiated every deal, and refused to spend on anything he deemed unnecessary. He would haggle with shop owners over trivial amounts. He would reuse tea bags. He lived like a man who had nothing, surrounded by more wealth than most nations. This included, as the world would soon learn, the safety of his own family. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how deep this tragedy goes, we need to start with the places themselves, the mansions, the estates, the billion-dollar monuments to a family that was falling apart from the inside, the villa that Paul never saw. In 1945, J. Paul Getty purchased a property in the Pacific Palisades, overlooking the shimmering Pacific Ocean. The 64-acre ranch would become the site of something extraordinary. Getty had a vision. He wanted to build a museum that would house his growing collection of Greek, Roman, and Etruscan antiquities. Not just any museum, but a recreation of an ancient Roman villa that had been buried by Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. Getty made the decision to build in the fall of 1968. Construction began on December 21, 1970. The Getty Villa would be a masterpiece, a recreation of the Villa of the Papyri from Herculaneum. It featured marble columns, reflecting pools, and gardens filled with olive trees and cypresses. Every detail was obsessively planned. The herringbone floors, the ornate ceilings, the way light would fall through the courtyards at different times of day. But here's the thing that still haunts the place. J. Paul Getty never saw it. He never walked through those marble halls, never stood in those gardens, never ran his hands along the walls of the building that bore his name. In 1951, Getty had left the United States permanently, settling in England at his estate called Sutton Place. He would never return to American soil while alive. When the Getty Villa opened to the public in January 1974, creating a sensation in the art world, the man who had commissioned it was sitting in his English manor, 6,000 miles away, surrounded by his collection of women who all lived together under one roof, competing for his attention and the scraps of his affection. The New York Times would later describe Getty's domestic arrangement as a collection of desperately hopeful women, all living together in his Tudor mansion, none of them aware that his favourite pastime was rewriting his will, constantly adjusting who would get what pittance after his death. One would receive $209 a month, another $1,167. These were the inheritance amounts for women who had shared his bed and his home. Getty died in June 1976, 2 years after his museum opened. He had spent the last 25 years of his life away from the country that had made him rich, away from his children, away from everything except his art and his money. His body was brought back to the ranch in Pacific Palisades and buried at the edge of the property on a private plot overlooking the ocean. But he wasn't alone in that quiet corner of earth. Beside him, 2 of his sons were already waiting. George and Timothy. Both had died before him, and the stories of how they got there reveal just how cursed this family had become. Timothy's forgotten tragedy. Timothy Getty was born in 1946 to J. Paul Getty and his 5th wife, Louise Dudley Lynch, a nightclub singer. Everyone called Teddy. The boy should have had everything. Instead, he had 12 years. When Timothy was 6 years old, doctors discovered a brain tumour. He went blind. The treatments were expensive, experimental, and ultimately futile. But what happened during those 6 years might be the saddest part of the entire Getty story. Teddy Getty later wrote in her memoir that her husband, one of the richest men who had ever lived, scolded her for spending too much money on their dying son's medical treatment. While the boy went blind and his body failed, his father, sitting in England, worried about the cost. Timothy died in 1958 at age 12. His father didn't attend the funeral. Teddy divorced J. Paul that same year. She would live another 59 years, dying in 2017 at the age of 103. That's 91 years of having to carry the memory of what her husband had valued more than their child's life. Timothy was buried at the ranch in Pacific Palisades, waiting in that California soil for the day his father would join him. When J. Paul Getty finally did, 18 years later, you have to wonder if the old man ever thought about that boy, the one he was too busy to save, too far away to bury. But Timothy wasn't the only son already in that ground. There was George too, and his story might be even darker. George's descent. George Franklin Getty II was born in 1924, the first son from J. Paul Getty's first marriage. He was the heir apparent, the one who was supposed to carry on the dynasty. In 1967, he was named Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Getty Oil Company. It should have been an honour, a sign of trust. But those who knew the family understood the truth. J. Paul Getty thought very little of his son's business abilities. George was essentially a figurehead, a man with a title but no real power. Major decisions were made without consulting him. His father made sure of that. George called his father Mr. Getty. Think about that. He didn't say dad or father. He used Mr. He told people that coming to see his father was like visiting Mount Olympus. He referred to Mr. Getty as the president in charge of success, and himself as the vice president in charge of failure. J. Paul Getty didn't attend his son's wedding. He rarely visited his 3 granddaughters. The emotional distance between father and son was vast enough to measure in continents. And George felt every mile of it. By the early 1970s, George had started drinking heavily. There are reports that he would jab his arms with a letter opener out of sheer frustration. The pain inside had to go somewhere. 1 week before his death, he wrote a letter to his mother that those who read it described as morbid. On June 6, 1973, George and his wife had a bitter fight. He locked himself in his bedroom with alcohol and pills. Neighbours reported hearing a shotgun fired into the air. There were threats. Then silence. At some point, in a moment that defies imagination, he stabbed himself in the belly with a barbecue fork. The family found him unconscious. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Worried about the scandal, worried about what the newspapers would say, worried about the Getty name, they delayed taking him to a hospital. Instead of calling an ambulance, they drove him to a distant private facility. By the time he arrived, it was too late. George Getty II, the man who had spent his life trying to earn his father's approval, died at age 48. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled it a probable suicide. J. Paul Getty's response, according to those close to the family, wasn't grief. It was concern about the publicity, about how the death would affect the family business, about which of his remaining sons was worthy of carrying on his legacy. George was buried at the Pacific Palisades Ranch in that same quiet plot where Timothy waited. And the question that hangs over that ground is simple and terrible. Did their father even notice they were gone? He would have noticed what happened next, though, because 1 month after George's death, the Getty curse would explode into international headlines. The kidnapping that shocked the world. John Paul Getty III was 16 years old in the summer of 1973. He was living in Rome, kicked out of boarding school, scraping by as a bohemian artist in the ancient city. Rome in the early 70s was a different place than it is today. The city had an edge, a wildness. It was the era of political unrest. Kidnappings were becoming almost common among wealthy Italians, and young people from around the world flocked there to live out their artistic fantasies among the ruins. Paul sold jewellery and paintings he made himself to fund his lifestyle. He had friends in the underground art scene, hung out in cafes and nightclubs, lived the kind of free-spirited existence that his grandfather would have found incomprehensible. The Italian newspapers called him the Golden Hippie. He was young, charismatic, and connected to one of the most famous names in the world. He had the Getty name, but not the Getty money. His father, John Paul Getty Jr., had been essentially cut off from the family fortune after his divorce from Paul's mother, Gail Harris. The split had been acrimonious, and J. Paul Getty had sided with his son initially, then grown disgusted with Junior's struggles with addiction. So young Paul, despite being the grandson of the richest man in the world, was nearly broke. He lived like any other struggling artist in Rome, except that his last name carried weight. His girlfriend at the time, Gisela Schmidt, would later say that Paul had once joked about staging his own kidnapping when money was particularly tight, but he had abandoned the idea when they both found work as models. It was just talk. A dark joke about the absurdity of having access to billions but not being able to pay rent. The kidnappers, it seemed, had been following him for some time. They knew his routine. They knew he often walked home alone late at night. They knew exactly who he was. At 3 a.m. on July 10th, 1973, just 1 month after his Uncle George had died back in California, Paul was walking home from a late night out near the Piazza Farnese. The ancient square was quiet at that hour, the Renaissance palaces casting long shadows under the streetlights. A car pulled up beside him. "Excuse me, signore, are you Paul Getty?" Paul confirmed his identity. That was his mistake. In an instant, hands grabbed him. A cloth soaked in chloroform was pressed over his face. The world went dark. He disappeared into the night. There were no witnesses. No one saw the car drive away. By morning, when friends started to wonder where he was, Paul was already hundreds of miles away, blindfolded and terrified in a cave in southern Italy. 2 days later, his mother Gail received a ransom demand. $17 million. That's $120 million in today's money. She didn't have it. She had been cut off from the family fortune in exchange for custody of her children when she divorced Paul's father. The divorce settlement had been clear. She could have the children, but not the money. So she did what the kidnappers knew she would do. She turned to her former father-in-law for help. J. Paul Getty's response has become one of the most infamous quotes in American history. "I have 14 other grandchildren," he said. "If I pay 1 penny now, then I will have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." For the richest man in the world, $17 million represented about 1 day's output from his oil fields. 1 day. But he refused to pay. At first, he believed it was a hoax, that his rebellious grandson had staged his own kidnapping. The media initially agreed. Newspapers ran stories questioning whether the whole thing was an elaborate scheme by a spoiled rich kid to get money from his grandfather. Paul's earlier jokes about faking a kidnapping came back to haunt him. Even his own family doubted him. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the truth became impossible to deny. Paul was being held in a cave in Calabria by members of the 'Ndrangheta, the brutal Calabrian mafia. He was blindfolded, imprisoned, terrified. He had no idea where he was, no sense of time passing, except for the meals they brought him and the changing temperature as day turned to night turned to day again. The kidnappers contacted his mother regularly, growing increasingly frustrated with the family's response. One of them, known as Cinquanta, actually yelled at Gail over the phone. "Who is this so-called grandfather? How can he leave his own flesh and blood in the plight that your poor son is in?" Even the criminals couldn't understand J. Paul Getty's refusal to pay. They were used to wealthy families fighting over how quickly they could gather the money. But this? A grandfather who wouldn't pay to save his grandson? It was unthinkable. The severed ear. By November 1973, Paul had been held captive for nearly 5 months. The kidnappers were running out of patience. They needed to send a message that they were serious, on a day that Paul would later struggle to remember clearly. Probably because his mind chose to protect him from the memory, they cut off his right ear. The ear was placed in an envelope, along with a lock of his hair, and sent to a daily newspaper in Rome. The letter that accompanied it was explicit. "This is Paul's first ear. If within 10 days the family still believes that this is a joke mounted by him, then the other ear will arrive. In other words, he will arrive in little bits." The Italian postal service was on strike. The package sat undelivered for 3 weeks. During that time, Paul's ear wound became infected. Combined with the cold and damp of the cave, he developed pneumonia. His captors, alarmed that their valuable hostage might die, gave him large doses of penicillin. He developed an allergic reaction to the antibiotic. To keep him warm and numb the pain, they poured brandy down his throat. Lots of it. When the package finally arrived and the photograph of Paul's severed ear appeared in newspapers around the world, J. Paul Getty finally agreed to negotiate, but not for the full amount. He would pay no more than $2.2 million. That was the maximum amount that would be tax deductible. The remaining $800,000 he agreed to loan to his son, Paul's father, at 4% interest. Think about that. The richest man in the world was charging his own son interest on a loan to save his grandson's life. Paul was finally released on December 15, 1973, found at a gas station in Lauria, in southern Italy. He had been held captive for 5 months. When he called his grandfather to thank him for finally paying the ransom, J. Paul Getty refused to come to the phone. 9 kidnappers were eventually apprehended. Only 2 were convicted. Most of the ransom money was never recovered. But the real damage couldn't be measured in money. Paul Getty III returned from captivity a changed person. The trauma of those 5 months, the infection, the drugs, the alcohol, the knowledge that his own grandfather had haggled over his life like a business deal, it broke something fundamental inside him. The aftermath and the stroke. In 1974, 1 year after his release, 18-year-old Paul married Gisela Zacca, who was 6 years older than him. They had a son, Balthazar, who would grow up to become an actor. For a brief moment, it seemed like Paul might find some kind of normal life. He attended Pepperdine University for a semester. He tried to move forward, but moving forward meant leaving the past behind, and the past wouldn't let him go. The demons from that cave in Calabria never left him. They followed him everywhere, in quiet moments, in crowds, in his sleep. He struggled with addiction, alcohol to numb the memories, drugs to quiet the nightmares, anything to feel something other than the terror that had marked those 5 months. People who knew him said he changed after the kidnapping. The carefree golden hippie was gone, replaced by someone haunted. He would have panic attacks, couldn't be in dark spaces, couldn't trust strangers. His girlfriend Gisela later described how Paul would sometimes wake up screaming, convinced he was back in that cave. In 1977, he had plastic surgery to rebuild the ear that had been severed. The doctors did their best, working with what remained, trying to create something that looked natural, but it never looked quite right. The reconstructed ear was a permanent reminder, visible every time he looked in the mirror, every time someone glanced at the side of his head. He saw what his grandfather's refusal had cost him, what being a Getty had cost him. The kidnapping had made international headlines. The story was sensational. The severed ear, the ransom negotiations, the richest man in the world refusing to pay. Everyone knew who Paul Getty was now. And everywhere he went, people stared. They whispered. They wanted to know what it was like. What did they do to you? How did it feel when they cut off your ear? Did you really think your grandfather would let you die? How do you answer questions like that? How do you explain what it's like to be 16 years old, blindfolded in a cave, listening to your captors argue about whether to mutilate you further? How do you describe the moment when you realise that the richest man in the world values his money more than your life? Then came April 1981. Paul was 25 years old when he suffered a massive stroke brought on by a drug overdose. The exact circumstances remain murky. Some reports say it was heroin. Others point to a combination of substances. What's certain is that the stroke was catastrophic. It left him paralysed from the neck down, unable to speak, unable to care for himself. Imagine being 25 years old, with your whole life ahead of you, and suddenly you can't move, can't talk, can't feed yourself or bathe yourself. You're trapped in your own body, totally dependent on others for every single thing. He would spend the remaining 30 years of his life in a wheelchair, completely dependent on others. 30 years. That's longer than he had lived before the stroke. 30 years of being cared for around the clock. 30 years of wanting to say things but being unable to form the words. 30 years of remembering what it was like to walk, to run, to live freely. His father, John Paul Getty Jr., who had himself struggled with addiction since his second wife, Talitha, died from a heroin overdose in 1971, initially refused to pay for Paul's medical care. The irony was bitter. The family had haggled over the ransom. Now they were haggling over medical bills. His mother, Gail, had to sue to get the necessary support for her son's care. She became his primary caretaker, the woman who had once been cut off from the Getty fortune, now spending her days caring for the grandson that J. Paul Getty had been too cheap to save properly. She fed him, changed him, talked to him for hours even though he couldn't respond. She advocated for him when he needed better care. She was there, day after day, year after year, while the Getty fortune continued to grow and accumulate in bank accounts and investment portfolios that Paul would never access. Paul Getty III died on February 5, 2011, at his home outside London. He was 54 years old. He had spent more than half his life in that wheelchair, a living reminder of what the Getty curse had done to yet another generation. When he died, some people called it a release, an end to decades of suffering. But his mother, who had cared for him until the end, knew it was something else. It was the final chapter in a tragedy that had started on a street corner in Rome 38 years earlier. But the curse wasn't finished, not even close. Andrew's final days. Andrew Rourke Getty was born in 1967, the son of Gordon Getty, the only one of J. Paul's sons who had managed to survive his father and inherit control of the family trust. Gordon had sold Getty Oil to Texaco in 1986 for $10 billion. He was worth billions. He was a classical music composer, a philanthropist, a fixture in San Francisco high society. His son Andrew should have had every advantage, every opportunity, every resource. Instead, Andrew became a recluse. He lived in a Spanish Revival mansion in the Hollywood Hills that he'd bought in 1996 from the estate of a film composer for $990,000. The house was spectacular. 8 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 4,700 square feet of living space sprawling across 7 hilly acres. It was built in the 1920s and had that old Hollywood glamour that modern homes can never quite capture. It had original leaded glass windows that caught the light in rainbow patterns, intricate tile work on the floors and in the bathrooms that craftsmen had laid by hand nearly a century ago. Wood-beamed ceilings that gave the rooms a sense of weight and history. Herringbone wood flooring that creaked in certain spots. The house settling and speaking in its own language. Arched doors and windows that framed views of the city below. A panelled library, a wine vault, a safe room, and a secret tunnel built during Prohibition that led from the house to the grounds. You can imagine bootleggers using it to move illegal liquor while police raided the front door. Outside, there was a kidney-shaped pool with a view that stretched across Los Angeles to the Pacific Ocean on clear days. A 2-story cabana, a bar area where parties had once been held, back when the house was full of life and laughter. But Andrew rarely used any of it. He was working on a film project that seemed to consume him. The Storyteller, a movie that took years to make, that he poured his money and time and soul into. A psychological thriller about obsession and madness. Those who saw the footage said it was dark, disturbing, brilliant in places, and incomprehensible in others. It would be released only after his death, and critics would struggle to make sense of it. He struggled with addiction. Methamphetamine, according to those who knew him. The kind of addiction that takes over your life, that makes everything else secondary. His on-again, off-again girlfriend later told authorities that he used it daily. It wasn't recreational. It was something else, a need, a compulsion. The mansion that should have been a showplace became a prison. Andrew would go weeks without leaving. The property fell into disrepair. The gardens grew wild. The pool collected leaves. Inside, the beautiful rooms became cluttered with film equipment, editing stations, stacks of footage and notes. It was the home of a man who had lost his way, who was drowning in his own project and his own demons. In March 2015, Andrew had been complaining of stomach pain for 2 months. The kind of pain that wakes you up at night. That makes it hard to eat. That gets worse instead of better. His personal assistant finally convinced him to see a doctor and scheduled an appointment for April 1st. He never made it. On March 31st, 2015, Andrew's ex-girlfriend came to the house. Just 2 weeks earlier, he had filed a restraining order against her, expressing concern that heated arguments could cause his blood pressure to rise dangerously. But she still had access to the property. When she arrived that afternoon and got no response, she went inside. She found him dead on his bathroom floor. The scene was bloody. An ulcer in his intestines had hemorrhaged, causing internal bleeding that eventually killed him. He had been dead for several days, alone in that massive mansion, bleeding out on the bathroom floor while the city hummed below and life went on everywhere except in that one room. The autopsy revealed the full story. Andrew had died from a gastrointestinal hemorrhage caused by ulcers in his intestine. But there was more. His blood showed toxic levels of methamphetamine. The drug hadn't killed him directly, but it had contributed. It had stressed his heart, raised his blood pressure, possibly made the bleeding worse. The coroner ruled the death accidental, listing the drug use and heart disease as contributing factors. Andrew Getty was 47 years old, almost the exact same age as his Uncle George when he died. Almost the exact same age as many of the Getty men who had come before him. There's a pattern there, if you look for it. Getty men don't seem to make it much past 50. They burn bright and brief, consumed by the weight of the name they carry. The mansion where he died eventually sold for $6.1 million. But there was a fight over the proceeds. Andrew had left a will naming an ex-girlfriend as his sole heir. His father Gordon claimed Andrew owed the family millions, that he had lived beyond his means and borrowed heavily from the family to fund his lifestyle and his film projects. The legal battle dragged on, 2 sides fighting over the estate of a man who had died alone in a bathroom, surrounded by wealth he couldn't enjoy and demons he couldn't escape. The new owners bought the house through a trust. They had plans to renovate it, to restore it to its former glory. But you have to wonder if a house can ever really be restored after something like that happens inside it. If the walls remember, the empty estates. Today, if you drive up the Pacific Coast Highway and look toward the hills, you can still see the Getty Villa. It's open to the public now, a museum housing 44,000 Greek, Roman and Etruscan antiquities. People walk through those marble halls, admiring the art, taking photos by the reflecting pools. Most of them don't know the stories. They don't know about Timothy, who never got to grow up, or George, who called his father Mister, or Paul, who lost his ear and then his body and then 30 years of his life to a wheelchair, or Andrew, found dead on a bathroom floor. The villa is beautiful, pristine, but there's something hollow about it. J. Paul Getty built it as a monument to classical civilization, to the glory of ancient Rome. Instead, it became a monument to something else, to the emptiness that can exist at the centre of infinite wealth, to the curse that seems to follow money when it becomes more important than blood. In January 2025, the Palisades fire swept through the area. The Getty Villa was threatened. 1,400 trees on the property burned. But the structure itself, built with fire-resistant materials, survived. It always survives. That's what buildings do. They outlast the people who made them. J. Paul Getty once said, "A lasting relationship with a woman is only possible if you are a business failure. I hate to be a failure. I hate and regret the failure of my marriages. I would gladly give all my millions for just one lasting marital success. He said he would gladly give all his millions. But when it came time to actually part with money for the people he claimed to love, for his sons, for his grandson, he couldn't do it. Or wouldn't. And in the end, maybe there's no difference. The Getty family fortune at its peak was worth billions. Today, the Getty Trust is one of the wealthiest art institutions in the world, operating multiple museums, research centres, and conservation institutes. The money is still there, doing what money does, accumulating, growing, outlasting. But the family? The people who bore the name? Their stories read like a Greek tragedy that J. Paul would have appreciated, if he'd had the emotional capacity to understand it. George, who died calling himself a failure. Timothy, who died too young to have a choice. Paul, who survived but lost everything anyway. Andrew, alone in his mansion. And all the others scattered through the decades, each one carrying the weight of a name that meant everything and nothing. The legacy. The Getty estates still stand. The villa in Pacific Palisades, open to tourists. The Getty Center in Brentwood, a billion-dollar complex of museums and gardens. Properties scattered across California, each one worth millions, each one perfectly maintained. But here's what strikes you when you learn the real stories. These buildings were supposed to be homes, places where families lived, where children grew up, where people found safety and love. Instead, they became stages for tragedies, backdrops for isolation, monuments to what happens when the accumulation of wealth becomes the only thing that matters. J. Paul Getty's father had predicted it. He said his son would destroy the family. And in a way, he was right. Not the business. The business thrived. But the family itself? Generation after generation marked by suicide, addiction, kidnapping, early death, and lives lived in the shadow of a fortune that promised everything and delivered very little of what actually matters. Balthazar Getty, the son of Paul Getty III, grew up to be an actor. He's spoken in interviews about the complicated legacy of the Getty name, about growing up knowing that your family has all the money in the world, as the Ridley Scott film about his father's kidnapping was called, but also knowing what that money cost, what it took from the people who had it. The younger Gettys, the current generation, have tried to distance themselves from the reputation. Some have become philanthropists. Others have gotten into fashion, art, music. They're trying to write a different story. But the ghosts are always there, in the mansions, in the museums, in the family plots where the bodies are buried and the secrets are kept. There's a plot of land at the Getty Villa, overlooking the Pacific Ocean, where J. Paul Getty is buried alongside his sons Timothy and George. It's private, not open to the public. Just a quiet corner of earth where a father and the sons he failed rest together for eternity. When the sun sets over the Pacific and the tourists leave the villa, when the gates close and the lights dim, you can almost feel it. The weight of all those unlived lives, all those missed chances, all that money that was supposed to protect and provide but instead created distance and destruction. The Getty Mansion, in all its forms, stands empty in the ways that matter most. Not physically empty. They're full of art, full of tourists, full of the trappings of culture and civilization. But empty of the thing they were meant to hold: family, love, the simple human connections that no amount of money can buy if you're not willing to give what they actually cost. J. Paul Getty died with more wealth than most people can imagine, but he died surrounded by women who competed for his attention, in a country that wasn't his home, never having seen the museum that bore his name, and having lost the love and respect of the children who should have mourned him. In the end, the tragedy of the Getty Mansion isn't about the buildings at all. It's about what happened inside them, or more accurately, what didn't happen. The conversations that never took place, the love that was never given, the prices that were never worth paying until suddenly they were, and it was too late. The estates remain. Beautiful, billion-dollar, empty. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.